This is Criteria.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Criteria. I'm Thomas Miras, here with my co-host James Majewski. Hey James.
Hello, Thomas.
We're here for a very momentous occasion.
Indeed.
Because we are discussing our final film on the Vatican film list. We started this project 3 years ago this month, May 2020.
Wow.
And we are now finally completing the Vatican film list with the 1927 silent film Napoleon, directed by Abel Gance, included on the Vatican film list under the category of art. Now, if you can't see the video, if you're just listening, you won't know James's hair is different from normal.
Yes. Yeah, after watching 5.5 hours of Napoleon and this awesome page boy haircut, I just had to go out and do it myself.
Is that what it's called?
Yeah, it's called the page boy.
Okay.
So long hair, but then it's basically just bangs on a boy.
Okay.
But
interesting.
I stopped short of wearing eyeliner for this episode. I thought, man, that would be really cool. But then I thought, it probably would not be as cool as I think it'll be. And then also, eyeliner is notoriously difficult to get off after the fact. So I would probably have to deal with like 2 or 3 days of just walking around town and not only like running into people I haven't seen in a while because I've been out of town for a while, and them having to be like, oh, James, you got a new haircut. But for them to also be like, oh, James, you started wearing eyeliner.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Final film. Number 45, of course, they're not included in the list in any particular order, but this is the one we kept to last because it's so epic. It's a 5.5 hour long film. I didn't mention that yet.
Epic is like a nice way of putting it was just too long to be bothered with before this moment.
Yeah. So now this is a film about Napoleon, as the title indicates, but the director, Abel Gance, this French filmmaker, he wanted this originally to be the first of 6 films about Napoleon.
Yo, that would have been awesome.
Yes. So this is going to be part 1 of 6, and it covers his young life up through his becoming the general in charge of the army in Italy. And what we have is only about 5.5 hours. I think the original is about 6.5 or 7 hours.
Dude, what a bummer.
Yeah.
I mean, it's great. What we have is great, and I'm glad that we have it. But
yeah,
like, I definitely was left with this feeling of, is that it? Which is a weird thing to say at the end of a 5.5 hour movie.
Right.
And it does have its own sort of arc. It feels complete at the end. But you really get the sense that everything's being set up for there to be more.
Well, now, how did you watch it? You watched it in parts?
I watched it over the course of 2 days. So,
Okay.
so I really just sort of watched the first half, which was like 2.5 hours. And then I watched the second half, which was about the same.
Yeah. So, I mean, my original plan was to watch it all on Sunday with my roommate, and we watched about half of it, and we were both pretty tired. And then, so I decided to watch the rest of the next day. I ended up splitting the rest of it into like 2 or 3 viewing sessions. But yeah, so it is really long. I think that when it was shown in theaters, it was shown all in one.
Sure.
I'm sure there was intermission, and there are intermissions.
Listen, I think it's
divided into 4 acts.
I think it's good enough that it could be watched all in one sitting.
Right.
I it's not that I didn't want to do that. It just, I think it's worked out that way that I wasn't able to. But but it's a surprisingly like fresh feeling experience watching this film from what is it, 1927?
Yeah.
This is almost 100 years old, what we're talking about. But it's got a little bit of everything. It's got battles, and it's got romance, and it's got political intrigue, and it's got, comedy, and it feels
romance.
Yeah. I mentioned that, but
Sorry.
No, a double helping of romance. It's got some weird trippy stuff too. It's like a very cool flick. And so when this was proposed, at the outset of this project, like, okay, we're going to watch all of these Vatican Film List films. One of them has to be last. It seems to me like a no-brainer to throw like some historical silent film about Napoleon of all people that's 5.5 hours long.
It's interesting that you're interpreting this in like a derogatory way. Mine was like, oh, this is like a fitting epic conclusion to our epic journey.
No, I was like so
movie.
Uninterested in watching this movie.
But for me, it was like, of course it has to be the capstone.
Yeah, well, that was like a convenient excuse for me to put this off. But,
yeah.
I'm so happy that it is our capstone, because it would be a bummer to go out with a whimper.
Yeah,
and this is definitely going out with a
We
bang.
didn't want to end with, the 1933 Little Women by, not to pick on that film, but we were like, this is fine, but I don't quite know why this is on the Vatican Film List,
Right.
Yeah, no, man, it's what an experience. And we didn't mention, all the technical accomplishments of this film as well. We already talked about D.W. Griffith with Intolerance and Birth of a Nation, and this is 12 years after Birth of a Nation, I think, and it does feel like kind of a continuation of the types of stuff that Griffith was doing. Yeah, it's a pretty crazy film. Now, this like many silent film classics, this film has a tortuous journey to how we're able to view it today. The film is hard to view in the US in its best form for various legal and copyright reasons. Just to give a quick history of the film. So like I said, it was originally reportedly about 6.5, 7 hours. But the American distributor MGM slashed it to less than an hour and a half for its 1929 release. And for that and other reasons, it was a flop in the U.S., and he was never able to raise the money to tell the rest of Napoleon's story.
Oh no!
Now, there were various versions. Gans lived for into the 1980s, I think, at least into the 1970s, and he was working on trying to get this film restored to its full version for the rest of his life.
Wow!
And was able to help with the restorations that did eventually happen. So it appeared in various versions. There was a 1979 restoration reconstituting about a third of the original film, and that was done by film historian Kevin Brownlow, and he has done a lot of restoration work and a lot of historical writing and documentary work about the silent film era, including the wonderful Hollywood multi-episode series about the Hollywood silent film, the origins of the movie business in America, which is all on YouTube. Fantastic. Highly recommend that series. Now, the film had an original score by Carl Davis, which is still what you hear today. And he's also kind of at this point now, I think this was early in his career working with silent film, but he has become a scorer of many silent films in the time since. So an edited version of this restoration was put out in the U.S. by Francis Ford Coppola, who was, flush with cash
Sure.
at the time, you know, coming off his hot run in the 70s. And there was a big tour playing this film in big movie palaces across the U.S., including Radio City Music Hall. I was reading a Reddit thread where some people who had been at that performance were commenting.
Oh, cool.
And they were talking about how they had a musical accompaniment of a full 40-piece orchestra conducted by Coppola's father, Carmine Coppola, who had like written a score, like patching together different classical composers, much like Carl Davis did in his score. And then at a certain point, the curtains draw back to reveal two equally sized screens on the other side of the main screen, because this film ends with the famous triptych sequence where you have three cameras just at sometimes making for like a super wide screen, and other times showing you different images at once, and sort of like different juxtapositions of images. And it's really spectacular. So I can only imagine that must have been quite an amazing
totally.
theatrical experience. Now I think that I want to say that version is like, you know, 4.5 hours, something like that.
Sure.
So eventually the most recent great restoration is the 2000 version by Kevin Brownlow. Again, about 5.5 hours. That's the version that we watched. Unfortunately, Coppola has the exclusive rights to release this in the US, and for some reason he prefers his version to Brownlow's, which is shorter. The crazy thing is that Coppola hasn't even put his version out on DVD or Blu-ray, so it's like it doesn't seem like he's even getting anything commercially out of preventing this to thus far biggest, you know, restoration from being released in the US. So the long and the short of it is that there's no legal way to get this commercially in the US. You basically have to torrent it, or you have to like get the British Blu-ray and use like a region-free Blu-ray player to play it. But I did read recent stories over the past couple of years that Netflix has made an agreement with Cinémathèque Française to restore the full 7 hours.
What?
So I don't know if that's happening, because it's kind of a couple years old news at this point. I don't know what the progress is on that, but yes. So if you want to try to see this film, if you're a Vatican film list completionist like us, you just have to look. You just have to look and find it. But it's worth it, I would say.
Whoa. You know what? Hold on, Thomas. Before we go any further, we've got to stop the conversation right here and talk about something very important. And yes, we are recording this in real time. We didn't record this after the fact and then splice it into the middle of the episode to make sure that you, listener, would hear it. We didn't wait until the very end to record this and then think, oh man, no one's going to get to the end of this conversation. We got to put it in now. We're doing it now, right here, in real time, in the moment. It's fundraising time. CatholicCulture.org, who sponsors this podcast. We are part of the Catholic Culture Podcast Network. We do a lot of work, a lot more than just this podcast, and it costs money. We need your help. We're in the middle of a big fundraising campaign called our Queen of May campaign. It ends on May 24th, the Feast of Our Lady Help of Christians. We're asking for her help, and we're asking for yours. We're trying to raise $50,000 to win a matching grant. That's right, $50,000 has been put up by certain key donors who are really going to help us out, but only if we can demonstrate that we're capable of raising those funds in matching funds as well. So yes, we're trying to get to 50,000. I think at this point we're about 15%, 20% of the way there. You know, we're running out of time. There's less than 2 weeks, but you know, there's like a whole category of donor that is the last minute giver, and that might be you. So please come to www.catholicculture.org/donate/audio, and that way we'll know that your donation is earmarked for our audio production.
Right.
You know, we're trying to build up a network of donors who are excited about our podcast offerings and want to support the work that we're doing. So if you like this podcast, if you like what you're hearing right now, if you've been with us through this long and twisting, windy road through the Vatican film list and are ready for us to, you know, break our bonds and go beyond, then yes, please shoot us a donation. Again, that's www.catholicculture.org/donate/audio.
I didn't realize I was in bonds this whole time, but you make a good point. Yeah, this film is like the ultimate biopic. I mean, again, it was intended to be one of 6 parts, and this thing is originally 7 hours long. So it is like the ultimate, long form TV
Totally.
or, whatever.
It feels like as I was watching it, I almost felt like I had lived parts of Napoleon's life because like you dwell. You stay on a moment for so long.
Right.
It creates this kind of like impression on you.
Right.
Of like, I'm not just getting information here about a narrative, about a story, but I'm also getting like impressed upon the sort of the tone of this moment.
Right. Right. Yeah. Well, when I first started watching the film, it starts with young Napoleon at a boarding school, and there's this big, brutal snowball battle, really. And at first I was like, this is spending a lot of time on this snowball battle. Then I felt like it was all worth it because like the stuff that they're doing with it just becomes more and more epic, and the camera techniques are becoming more and more interesting, and there's all these amazing like handheld shots, stuff that I have never seen in a silent film this before. These shaky handheld cams and like and then the first real use of this overlapping. Well, a lot of like rapid cutting, which is something that he does a lot in the film at climactic moments. And then also this like overlapping visions where we see Napoleon, like, the young general directing his comrades in the snowball battle. And he's sort of like, you see just a close up of his face, but with like all this other stuff going on in the frame as well.
Right.
Like all the things that he's seeing and sort of directing, and it's like still that is probably my favorite sequence of the film, honestly. Like that made the most like powerful impression on me. But the film, it does really dwell on all of these moments that like some of which are maybe not if you were doing a 2.5 hour biopic, wouldn't probably get mentioned at all.
You could see how, some hack who wanted to shorten this to an hour and a half could easily do so.
Right.
It's like you don't lose a lot of biographical information by just like cutting some of these sections in half or maybe excising them altogether. But what you do lose is like, like what I was describing is like the impression of these moments,
right?
The cinematic impression that's created,
right?
I think that what makes the film so exciting to watch is not so much the story that's told, although that's fine.
Yes,
it's not so much the performances, although those are fine too.
Yeah.
It really is what you're pointing to. It's the use of the camera. It's the pictures that are created. It's this visual feast for the eyes,
right?
To use the cliche.
Lots of different colors too. We didn't mention that as well. A lot of different tinting for different scenes.
Which keeps it feeling really fresh.
Yes.
Fresh as you're moving from one sort of chapter in his life to another.
Even just the whiteness of the snow scene at the beginning is different from like a normal black and white.
Totally. Yeah, so I was so impressed by that, and talking about how it feels kind of fresh and still very contemporary. I think it's that it's the cinematography that does it the most.
Yes,
and
it left me wondering, honestly, like what happens to some of these techniques. I think sound, honestly, is the answer for a lot of that.
Totally.
But I find myself wishing that mainstream cinema would use more of these different visual techniques. It's not like it's hard to understand.
No.
What you're seeing, it's just a different way of getting at the experience.
Right. There's something that feels still very experimental. Well, and I guess it would have been experimental at this time. We're talking early days of cinema. And so you can see that the director is trying to employ all of these different techniques, trying to like exhaust everything that's available to him in the tool set to convey information about,
in a very psychological way. He's trying to get you into Napoleon's head a lot of the time, and see what he sees and imagine what he's imagining.
Totally.
So I have to say, I mean, I totally agree with you about the best, most powerful like resource of this film being the cinematography. And I don't mean that just in the sense of like being impressed with the technique. I do think it has like an actual emotional impact.
Right.
pretty much in all cases when he's doing these kind of these like unusual techniques. So the flip side of that, though, is that like to the extent that the film becomes like a normal silent film narrative is to the extent that like I found myself less interested, precisely because I'm not that interested in the story of Napoleon told in this way with the intent that it has, which is essentially like a mythologizing, very detailed, but like very mythologizing portrait, like very, lionizing portrait of Napoleon, at least thus far in his story. There's not much sign that would have changed in the next 6 episodes. And I think I have to say, and you may or may not agree, I think that this points to perhaps a weakness in doing such a large scale, long story in silent film. I think that if you're going to tell a story about Napoleon that interests me and is really saying something about the time and about who he was and his strengths and weaknesses, I think you almost have to have the full resources of dialogue to be able to do that, in my opinion. If you're going to do a story that lasts this long, because virtually none of I have to say that not virtually none, it's too harsh, but few of the things that I'm really interested in about this period and about Napoleon are making their way into this story. And I don't think that's just because the director is praising the French Revolution and you know what I mean? I don't think it's just because of his view of history, but I think it's also because the film is like it's bringing you almost into a world of pure emotion. And it can't necessarily articulate all of the complexities of, let's say, not that it really depicts this, but if it were to depict Napoleon's relationship with the church, which was quite interesting. And I was reading the old Catholic encyclopedia article about Napoleon because I was sort of curious about this. And he had a very complicated and interesting diplomatic relationship with the Pope at the time and stuff. I would love to see, if FX or HBO were Catholic, I'd love to see them make one of their endless miniseries and devoted to the worthy topic of the diplomatic face-off between Napoleon and I think Pius VII. I think that would be cool. But and I could be wrong, but I do think that if there are limits to the if you're gonna do such a deep dive into a person, I think there's limits to what you can do with the silent film medium.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting idea. I hadn't thought about it that way before. I'm confident that there would be ways to do it because could
you do it relying on dialogue as little as this film does? Because even for a silent film, this film really goes light on the dialogue.
Yeah, but let's think about some of the sort of the intrigue that goes on as Napoleon is coming into his own in the military and upsetting other officers along the way. And there's a sort of careful balancing act that needs to be, that he has to chart a course as he ascends the ladder of command without getting totally, without totally pissing off his superiors and getting shut out. So the moment that I'm thinking of is when my favorite sequence was the big battle that happens sort of in the second half of the first part. You know what I'm talking about, the long sequence, the battle of
in the rain.
Yeah,
the
right.
muck, yeah,
amazing.
This is where Napoleon basically is given a chance to show him his ability as a commander, and then his command is threatened, and he basically, through sheer force of will, convinces them to let him just take responsibility for the course of this battle, and he comes out on top.
But what does he have to do? He has to go against the orders that have been given to him, and so we see a little bit of the fallout of that. We see a little bit of how he's dealing with receiving this command and making the decision that he does. And admittedly, I'm almost proving your point here because some of the details of this plot line escape me because there's only so much that you're picking up on in this silent film, fast moving format. But But like the other sort of like young commander who's sort of out to get Napoleon, we see how he's leveraging the situation to try to do Napoleon in. But then Napoleon shows up and sort of puts himself on the line, and there's an extended kind of negotiation between him and his superior, the person who's really in command of this fighting force. And we don't get any intercards telling us what the conversation is, but we can see in their performances the back and forth that's going on. So we can infer and think about what's being exchanged. And in some ways, it makes it even more intriguing because I'm able to speculate, even if not explicitly, I'm able to sort of like, in a subconscious sort of impressionistic way, just like buy in, oh, you know, this is like a really big conversation that's happening. I don't need to know the details. So I think that it might not look the same, for instance, as an HBO miniseries would, that is relying on dialogue and is relying on the delivery of like specific details through speech and text. But I think that I'm confident that there would be a way to kind of, to sort of flesh out some of this nuance. Yeah. Because actually, even though this film does kind of come across as a bit of like a hagiography, you know.
It's basically it is to Napoleon as the old school American like civic education was to like George Washington, and lovingly dwelling on this larger than life figure and the lovingly dwelling on these stories about his life, but like with this kind of like emotionalized patriotic gloss over everything. Sure.
But I will say that even if it wasn't the director's intention, what we end up getting is, I think, something that is a little more nuanced than just that. Because I think that whether it's with Napoleon or with the French Revolution, or with, you know, members of the court, you do end up seeing some of the insanity.
Oh, sure,
you know?
Sure.
So it's like the impression you get of Napoleon is that this is a great man, but that this is also a maniac, you know? And I don't, and even, so even if it isn't the director's point, I bring that up to say, well, what if it had been, how much more so could he have towed this line, you know? And so I do think
I think the depiction of Napoleon was like pretty much entirely positive, even if it was like focusing on like.
But it's funny because that was not my experience of watching it. Like the whole time I was really kind of impressed by how like troubled I was by this character. And again, I don't know that this was his intention. It probably wasn't from the director's point of view. But my experience was definitely one of like simultaneous awe and terror, you know, at this figure. And part of that is probably me bringing what I know.
There is a nod to that in the wedding scene where they're signing their Is that the scene I'm thinking of where they're signing they do this quick civic ceremony, Napoleon and Josephine says to her former lover, who's basically managed to foist her off into marrying Napoleon, she says, you know, he scares me, you're Napoleon.
Well, there's a lot of moments like when the Revolutionary Convention asks him to sort of take command to beat back the royalists, you know, and he comes into the convention hall and says, like, from this moment forward, I am the revolution. You know, it's like chilling, you know, it's not like,
interesting,
you know, maybe for them, they're like clapping, but you're watching this like, ooh, you know?
Well, I think, I guess it depends on your perspective towards towards the revolution in part. I mean,
but even the revolution too, like,
the revolution itself in this film is treated, I think, as like almost this abstraction. Because the film comes down negatively on the Reign of Terror. For sure. But the revolution itself is seen as almost something that's above all that. Like, it's this cause that, like, you know, sure, these unnecessary things were done, but the revolution is this pristine
but see, like, for me, it was almost as if that was Napoleon's perspective on it.
Okay.
You know, that for Napoleon, it was something that was like an abstraction that he could then sort of apply to himself. When he stands in this empty convention at the end of the movie.
One of my other favorite scenes in the whole
gosh,
film.
it's awesome. And like the ghosts of all of these people who have now the revolution is swallowed,
Yeah.
you know, appear to him and say like, you are the one who must bring the spirit of the revolution to all of Europe.
Well, because we've seen some of these guys portrayed as psychos,
Yes.
it does come off as kind of like, I don't know what you'd call it, like, you know, not Hamletian, but like, yeah.
Well, but it's
Like, who are these spirits? You know?
Dude, to me, it felt diabolical.
Right.
You know, it was like all of this nightmare that has gripped France and caused so much bloodshed. Now you, Napoleon, you must take this out and bring it to all of Europe. And it's like, oh man,
Totally, yeah.
You know,
yeah. It's such a great scene. We've had so many scenes with the convention hall just absolutely jam packed with people, and he comes there as he's leaving Paris for Italy to just reflect on things, and he's there by himself, and already it's very powerful because you're getting this big wide shot of this giant hall and this little figure coming in through the door. And then I just, at a certain point when he's looking out at the empty seats, I just knew what Gans was going to do. You know, he's going to slowly materialize all these transparent figures of Robespierre and Danton and Saint-Just and all these, you know, architects of the Reign of Terror, and all, you know, these other people as well. Yeah, it's quite fascinating, and it's kind of like, you know, I read it as like, this is Napoleon's we're supposed to read this as Napoleon's imagination, but still, it is creepy, especially coming from my perspective, where I'm like, I'm not into this at all.
Right. Which is why, you know, I would say that, especially for a Catholic viewer, don't approach this film as, you know, as though it's just pro-Napoleon propaganda. I think if you watch it sort of with the thought that what I'm seeing here is kind of a portrait of a monster, madman, genius, great man, that there's actually a lot to be gained from that, you know?
Okay, interesting.
But you know, like I will grant that probably, not knowing anything about the background of this film except what you've already mentioned, this probably was just like an attempt to write a hagiography on Napoleon.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and whatever the views of the filmmaker, you know, it could also be one of those D.W. Griffith type things where it's like, I need material for my epic film that I want to make.
Yeah.
And here's an appropriately epic subject. For all I know, that could be
totally.
that could be the approach, where, because D.W. Griffith, you know, we talked about his flip-flopping between different viewpoints in his films, and Gans was noted, some people felt that he was a bit of a flip-flop in sort of one of his early films that was notable was a film he made during World War I, and he had the gumption to make an anti-World War I film during World War I, using military like help and funding. They didn't know that it was going to like be a pacifist film, and he actually had soldiers like who were just on leave from the front and were about to like go back and die, playing like dead men and dying men, and they had just like, and then for like a couple weeks, and then they went back and like got killed.
Oh my goodness!
So
wow,
I forget the name of that one, but
yeah, well, that was one of the things about that battle sequence that I was referring to before. One of the things that struck me was how horrific it was.
Yeah.
You know,
but if I can just say, the reason I brought up World War I is that, you know, and then he goes on to make other films that are like seemingly in praise of these kind of like warmongering dictator figures, you know. Some people were like, well, what's going on with this guy? Does he have...
Well, but you know, but this movie is a great example of how you get both. You get the valor and the glory, and like some amazing moments where oh my gosh, at the end of that battle sequence when Napoleon is asleep on a drum, you know, like on this like mound with like bodies strewn around, and the army gathers, and the eagle lands on the tree and the sun starts to shine, and it's
this eagle stuff is also like, again, the George Washington comparison is perfect because the eagle is an American thing, a French thing, a Roman. It's everybody wants the eagle, you know,
right?
And this eagle, imagine we would be laughing if we saw a film today about George Washington that was like fluctuate, juxtaposing his face with an eagle and like all this stuff. But they can get away with it in that era, I guess. But it's just funny. But the actor, I forget his name, who plays the adult Napoleon, he does have these kind of eagle eyes, these like intense gaze.
Sure. Yeah. But what I'm saying for a sequence that ends with such a glorious sort of setup, it's preceded by just total carnage,
right?
And it feels like World War I trench warfare. It's mud and it's rain and it's explosions.
He does a great job of getting you into the like confusion in some of these battle scenes, which I really appreciate. That's one of the really cool things about, like I said, that it feels ahead of its time with some of the camera techniques that he's using. I think we were talking about this before, so I want to make sure that I actually say it on camera. Is that he's using, well, I mentioned the shaky cam, but he's like putting cameras on. It seems like in one scene there's a horseback chase. It seems like the camera is on a horse,
right.
which is something I've never seen in a silent film. It's like bobbing up and down. You're seeing just like a close up of the horse's head. Some of the angles at which the movement is happening reminded me of the ride of the Rohirrim scene in Peter Jackson's Return of the King.
Totally. That horseback chase where I think he's fleeing Corsica and they're chasing him on horseback. Right. It was very reminiscent of the Arwen Nazgul flight.
Yes, also shot on location in Corsica, which is a cool thing for the silent film era. It's fascinating to see that he can recreate like the chaos of battle, in a
close
film like
quarters
this.
Combat with bayonets,
and he starts out with a snowball battle, and then moves from there.
That's right.
Because we were talking about the battle scenes in Intolerance also being akin, the siege scenes in Intolerance being akin to Jackson's, the Helm's Deep sequence, and in that we got the sort of scale of it and the machinery of it and stuff, and the collapsing buildings and stuff. But I don't think we got so much of like the putting you inside the battle like we do with this film. So in that way, it does feel like building on what D.W. Griffith was doing.
I loved it. I thought that whole extended battle sequence was just amazing and, definitely ahead of its time. And then, there were a few moments that were genuinely disturbing. Where you see someone get run over by a carriage wheel or something, or blown up, bodies like face down in the mud, twitching or something. It's definitely still graphic, which also, I guess this isn't Hollywood, but it is pre-code, and it belongs to an era where I guess there was still, it just brings me to consider how like there's some stuff that I was almost like shocked to see,
well, we had some nudity in, this is like a great, parallel to what I was just saying about the development from Griffith to here, because in Intolerance you had some nudity, some still images of nudity at this like Babylonian, whatever it is, I forget.
Right.
But, in this, there's this party scene, and like again, he's bringing you inside with like some very exploitative shots, but also that are giving you like the vivid image of this like bacchanal that's happening, with like all of these like crazy zooms and the camera like bobbing back and forth, and
it's the part that feels the most anachronistic. It almost feels like I don't know, like it made me think of like Baz Luhrmann doing The Great Gatsby or something, or this Elvis movie that just came out. Like there's stuff that's very stylized. The party feels very 20s, it's like, this is like the girl, it's like Flapper Girls, I don't know that this is what it would have looked like in Napoleon's day. But even Napoleon himself, he's got this like studded, like glitter suit that he wears throughout that sequence, and it's awesome because it really sort of conveys, in his dress, sort of where he is now, which is like very different from where we pick up with him. He's kind of like now in the glamour of coming into his own in Paris, high society and power. But but yeah, when I say anachronistic, I also mean like very stylized, very like this might have suggested something more to its audience in 1927, even more than what it suggests to us now, you know. But yeah, it's like I like the comparison. I like the comparison that you just made with how it really does bring you into the kind of like the chaos of it, you know? And again, it's just another example of how, because the director has this freedom to dwell on these moments and not pass through them so quickly, they're allowed to have their own power. You know, he's able to have the time to really shape a sequence to kind of be its own thing.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. It is interesting. Yeah. The way he uses some of these similar techniques, but with different twists too.
Right.
Like, and in ways that you wouldn't expect, because we were just talking about like this camera movement, that instability of it. But there's also this really interesting scene where Napoleon is like sort of on this little raft, using the flag as a sail, trying to escape from Corsica back to France. And at the same time, we're cutting back and forth to the chaos of the convention.
Right.
And how it's like this just like bloodthirsty mob and people stabbing each other in the back. And the camera in the convention scene is like swinging back and forth as though you were still in the storm scene. My only complaint being that like I didn't want to like actually feel like physically nauseous while watching the scene, which is what happened.
Oh, come on. Yeah, it was awesome.
But it's fascinating, and it was inspired by a line in Victor Hugo saying like being a member of the convention was like being on a wave on the ocean. And I wanted to read this little line, this excerpt from Abel Gance's script, because it's interesting. The sky is lit up with lightning flashes, the tumultuous assembly rising and falling in a terrifying swell streaked with flashes of the guillotine blade, a head falling with each flash. In all caps, words can no longer describe the parallels. Who can try to explain music in words? Indescribable, double storm, inner dynamism, again in all caps, suggestion rather than evocation. I'm
That's
like, what
great.
kind of script is this?
But that's awesome. that totally makes sense to me, because that is the impression. That's great. I love that.
Yeah. One thing that I came away with, if we're going to talk on like a thematic and a moral level, is this film's depiction of how easy it is to manipulate a mob. You know, how all these different figures seduce the mob in various directions, how shallow it all is, just with like a speech or with, you know, whatever it is, you know, the convention being a good example of that. The way that the mob is sort of thrown back and forth in these different directions, you know, I think that's one aspect where my judgment of it and the director's judgment of it probably come together.
Sure.
Because even though the director is pro French Revolution, yes, anti Reign of Terror, I think that I think there is like definitely a certain kind of awareness, even aside from the specific critique of the Reign of Terror, that like, okay, yeah, so you can get the mob to do something good, but that like the danger of the mob and the kind of like the shallowness of the kind of the manipulation of the mob, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Yeah, there's that line when again, it's when the convention asks Napoleon to beat back the royalist insurrection, and he says, "But I warn you, once my sword is unsheathed, it shall not return to its scabbard until order is restored."
Right,
and it's like literally a double-edged sword,
right?
Because the implication is that, you know, I might have to bring order to the revolution,
right,
you know,
right.
And so. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. Napoleon was not one of these, like, he was not one of the Reign of Terror guys. He was a real French patriot, and he wanted to, for example, and this is depicted in the movie, he's offered a post in the Vendée, which is where there's these Catholic uprisings against the revolution, and he chooses not to take it because he doesn't want to fight against fellow French. He wants to fight against the enemies that are, you know, besetting France. And, you know, another example of that is that, like, and this isn't really shown in the movie, but I was reading about the fact that he wasn't one of these guys who really hated the church. He did various things to the church that were not good, but it was really about the the power and like the balance of power. It wasn't like he hated the church in an ideological sense. It was more like, okay, Pope, you got to tell the priests to like obey the revolutionary government and things like that.
Sure.
So like not good, but also like he wasn't one of these like, it seems like he was a great figure, but he wasn't, it was more like his pride, but he wasn't like inherently, it feels like he's not like inherently a destroyer.
Well,
you know?
and he came back to the church, didn't he? Before
yes,
he died?
he reconciled with the church in exile on Saint Helene.
Received last rites.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So it's interesting. I would recommend going to read that, and it would have been interesting. I'm sure that I would imagine that would have been more covered, you know, as it went on.
Sure.
The diplomacy and things.
Yeah. Dude, but you know, like there's so much great stuff that like the seed is planted that doesn't get realized.
Right.
You know, like his love affair with Josephine, for instance, you know, like how at the end it's almost like she becomes conflated with the world,
right?
You know, and her face is constantly being superimposed on the globe, and there's this amazing sequence where he's like kissing a globe and like and caressing
I love the
it.
Courtship. I loved the courtship sequences were pretty funny.
Well, but you know what it reminded me of was the Great Dictator, Chaplin, like you know, spoofing Hitler and playing with the globe. Okay. Have you seen this sequence? Like he has like a blow up like beach ball of of the world, and he's like playing with it, you know, and so yeah, there's humor in this film, but it's also like a troubling humor, you know. It's like
right. Well, when Josephine says like this guy scares me, it's not just referring to his intensity, but also to her kind of mercenary nature, because she was I was also reading up on their relationships, that she was kind of immersed. She would just go with whatever guy would take care of her,
right?
You know, and it's apparent from their letters that he loved her a lot more than she loved him. We see in the letter him sending these in the movie, him sending these intense letters to her when he's out in Italy, and in real life apparently she just sent him these kind of like tepid responses. And now of course eventually he did pull a Henry VIII and divorce her because she couldn't provide him an heir and he needed an heir. But but even then, after that, unlike Henry VIII, he kind of like he kind of like swore like eternal like friendship and esteem for her. And but yeah, she kind of, it's interesting this movie does manage to get across the kind of the different places that each of them are coming from. Totally.
What do you make of this moment where she discovers this shrine built to him by an unrequited lover, and then not only does she sort of stumble upon this unrequited lover praying before this shrine, but she gets down and joins her, you know?
It's weird.
It is. It's really super weird. It's super weird. And I think it complicates the view of Napoleon, you know? Like I think it doesn't fit nicely into the hagiography. It doesn't fit nicely into the lionizing. It's like, well, this guy had a charisma and a power that was seductive in like this, even this deeper way,
right?
You know, this is more than just like a romantic infatuation. It's like a religious worshiping,
right?
You know, right. And you think about that portrait, that famous portrait of him, you know, sort of as like a Roman emperor of old, you know. Do you know the one that I'm talking about? Him like holding like the globe and the scepter. Yeah. I didn't look this up before recording, but I seem to recall there being like some epic portrait of Napoleon looking like an old Roman emperor god, nice. You know. And oh man, you know, you just kind of, you get the sense watching this that the director wants to take us there, you know, that it's not going to be all like peaches and cream, that there's going to be some like, you know, vaulting ambition.
Right. Yeah, because that's the thing is like, you have to think that like, you can't make 6 of these and just keep the same like tone of just like, that's like sort of uncomplicated Napoleon worship for 6. It would be really dull.
I think if you look at the way that Gans handles the revolution, I think there's reason to think that he was probably setting this up to subvert it later on, because you have to sort of articulate the power with which this guy comes onto the scene as a young man and starts winning people to his side, but then there's so much more of the story to tell.
Yeah. You can imagine these ghostly figures coming back to haunt him in future installments.
Exactly. Yeah. So now there is a new Napoleon biopic in the works, isn't there?
Yes. Yeah. What's his face who did Alien?
Yeah, what's his face who did Gladiator? Ridley Scott.
Ridley Scott, yeah. I think it's like pretty soon.
Yeah. So that'll be exciting to see, if they manage to but you have to imagine that Ridley Scott is has watched this film and is probably having some of these same kinds of questions that we're having now, like what could it have been if he had been allowed to tell this whole story?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. But there's so many great moments. Like one of my favorites is so Napoleon and his future wife Josephine and her ex-husband are in jail in the same time, waiting execution, and I guess that she had been divorced a couple years before, but her name gets called for execution, and it turns out there's two people with her last name, her and her ex-husband. And so the guy says, I just need one. So you figure it out, Yeah. And her husband kisses her hand and says, for once, madame, allow me to take precedence. And then goes off to his death. And I just thought it was pretty sweet.
The sort of cherry on top of this is that years later, Napoleon has this big extravagant victims ball, and in order to attend you have to have demonstrated that either you were in prison or no, what was it was one of your siblings or your parents or some relative was killed in the Reign of Terror,
right? And
Josephine attends, ostensibly because her ex-husband was killed during the Reign of Terror,
right?
And it's this guy died in your stead, and now you're getting to go to this ball because he died. It's just too much.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Another favorite from the Reign of Terror is the Eater of Documents.
Oh,
apparently there was this guy who would just eat documents of names of people who were to be executed so that they wouldn't get killed. It's pretty hilarious.
It is hilarious.
This really long sequence.
Yeah, I wish that as I had been watching this, because I only watched it once. There was no way I was going to watch this twice. In preparation for this, but I wish I had been keeping a log of all of these great moments, because that's another thing that you get from being able to sort of work unencumbered from time constraints,
right?
Is that with the sheer duration,
you don't get to finish your story.
But you do get these little moments that would probably otherwise get cut.
Another thing I liked from that same sequence is in the office where they're all working to sign people's death warrants. Basically, the guy who's there's this giant shelf of all these files, and there's this guy who's on some kind of contraption where he's being hoisted up to it just had a very Mad Max. It made me think of the little midget guy in Mad Max Fury Road.
Sure, totally.
This kind of weird character.
But not unlike Mad Max, this film really succeeds at building a world. I mean, it's like 20s Ridley Scott. A lot of this is shot on location. There's amazing sets, amazing costumes. He uses tons of extras.
Yeah.
You'll be in the waiting room to see Napoleon or something, and there's just tons of extras who are all
Why is it
crowded.
so much harder to get huge crowds of extras now? Is it because they have to pay them or something, or there's a union? I've heard said that back in the day, they were more able to get these and costume these huge crowds of extras, and that's something that doesn't happen.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't see why it would be any more or less difficult. Yeah. Except that maybe just it's not in vogue aesthetically.
Yeah. But there's so many great there's just so many great little poetic romantic details that I think some of are taken from history or from legends that already existed. And another of my favorites is from that big battle scene in the rain where all the drummers are killed. And then Napoleon's where are the drummers? And then hail starts falling and hitting the drums. I thought that was one of the coolest scenes.
That was awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the score, at least on the version that we watched, was just fantastic.
Yes.
And the way that certain sounds are sort of synced up with the action. I mean, and when the drums come in, when the hail starts falling, just like really great. And,
For sure.
and I love too that the film is really light on the text. We're not getting a lot of these, intercards with back and forth, and in a lot of instances, if there is stuff being said, we're allowed to just sort of project into it. And we kind of just get like the bare bones. There's a poetry, like for instance, in the courtship between Josephine and Napoleon at the party, I think there's really like only like one back and forth, like one line maybe that's said each way by them as he's literally playing a chess game. Oh man, he's playing a chess game with this other guy who has eyes for Josephine, and he says, "I'm about to take your queen," and it's like a great moment. But then what does she say to him? She says something about like, "What weapons do you fear most?" or something like that. And he like looks straight at her and he's looking like dead into the camera and he says, "Fans, madame," as she's fanning herself, and it's like the elegance and like the economy of words in this. I really appreciate too, because things get very easily broken up by text in these silent films. You have to get creative about how am I going to convey this, like most efficiently, and it's going to be by creating that impression through the image and through the performance, like through the setting, like this is literally happening over a chess game.
Yeah, I think by the end of the film you do get like a real, again, and maybe if this is the only thing that he wanted to do, then he succeeded, that you do, even if you don't agree with Napoleon or the French Revolution, I think you do come away with like a certain respect for the man.
Totally. Totally. Determined to get a haircut like him.
And it's interesting because, I loved the kid who plays young Napoleon. It was maybe my favorite performance, the most fun performance for me to watch in the film. And very dynamic and a lot more different emotions than in the adult Napoleon, who is very like staid and kind of like restrained and very detached in some ways. But I think that like for my experiences, by the end of the film, I felt like I was seeing more in that adult Napoleon, in his face and like in his gaze.
Sure.
Like, and one example of that, which I really liked, is the scene where he finds out that he's been given the generalship of the Italian army. And he kind of like, it's like this delayed reaction where he's kind of like processing it, and the guy who gives him the news is like, what's going on? Why aren't you like excited? And then finally he just like, and then we get like one of these awesome intertitles with like the blaze, like the water in the the flowing whatever,
we get that image again at the end of the film.
The crest of the wave moving behind the intertitle, and he says, "At last!"
Yes,
it's just like so sweet.
It's great.
Yeah,
man. Oh, dude, I really wish that this director had been allowed to realize his vision, but then again, maybe it's better this way. Maybe it is better that we're allowed to wonder.
But what I'm saying with that is, it's cool that like we do get to see Napoleon spending so much time like on the sidelines and not really doing much, and especially in his early life, just kind of like this little lieutenant guy, you know, and so then when he finally gets his recognition, it's like so sweet.
Yeah, well, I guess before we finish talking about this, we should spend a little more time talking about the climactic sequence that you referred to before, that triptych sequence.
Yeah.
That was a surprise to me. I didn't know that was coming.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. So I thought that was pretty cool. I don't know, what'd you make of it?
Well, like I said, at some points it's like a super wide screen. At other points he's showing you Napoleon and the people he's speaking to, or he's kind of showing you I don't know, different aspects of a march. Like in one case you've got the soldiers, this sort of grubby, like, ramshackle Italian army walking, and then you've got Napoleon riding, but you're seeing it like twice. It's like doubled the images on either side of the troops.
Yeah.
It's interesting that the way I was really impressed with the way that with the music and the intertitles and the colors and everything, the way that like the director gets you to see not so much Napoleon, just Napoleon, but like the army itself, this like dirty, like, you know,
yeah, well, because they're in the center of the frame, you know?
Yeah, Italian army. He gets you to see them as like the force of destiny at the end of the movie, which I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah.
Because, you know, at first it's kind of like this ridiculous, pathetic, you know, excuse for an army, and then within, you know, 10 minutes or something like that, you get to see them like marching with determination, and the way that it's framed and the different colors, and eventually the triptych turns into the tricolor flag. So you've got the blue and the red on either side of the white, the black and white.
Totally. But then again,
frame.
like even there, and this may not have been the director's intention, but there's something sinister about this moment because, you know, yes, the rabble is in the center and they're marching forward into history, but they're flanked on either side by a galloping Napoleon who's like driving them on, almost as if he was like the prison warden or like the slave master or something, you know, like keeping them in line and keeping them from breaking ranks or escaping, you know. He's on both sides of them, driving them forward, you know. It's a different impression than if you had framed him, you know, like leading them in the front or something, or even standing alongside them. There's something kind of like also in the difference in the pace, because they're marching, but he's galloping, you know, and there's two of him. So there's just something kind of unsettling, and about the
intertitles do say something about he's like fantasizing about like destroying and creating worlds,
exactly,
like that. The play of his imagination,
and then again we get the eyes and the vision, the gaze of Josephine, you know, in his mind, and she's like looking at him and like looking into the camera, looking to the audience, you know, and smiling and laughing, and like there's something kind of, you know, crazed about it. You know, that whole sequence is like it's
and she's the one who gets him the gig of the general. She only agrees to marry him on the condition that her former lover will appoint him as the general of the Italian
But do you see what I mean? Like there's like this multivalent quality to that ending where it almost you know, it bursts the bonds of just being some sort of like grandiose finish to this epic, you know, lionizing mythology of Napoleon. And there is something kind of unsettling about where we're left, you know, and then if you know history, you know that it is going to be kind of complicated, you know?
Yeah. I mean, it's a certain approach towards great men, you know, of like, there's something terrible about them as well. You know, especially if you're looking at it in a secular sense. If you had like, no matter how much somebody admired Julius Caesar, for instance, and many people throughout history have, I would think they would have to admit there is like something terrible about being Caesar, you know? So anyway, but you raise some interesting points. I want to sit down and see that sequence and the climax of the snowball sequence again. There's a couple things that I'd like to watch again.
Well, that snowball sequence, I mean, that thing's crazy too, because, you know, you have this child who's covered in like snow and sweat and debris and mud and blood, even where he got hit by a rock. And so there's something grotesque
and
about
his face. Gets more and more like covered in snow and ice.
And he's like smiling, he's laughing as the enemy boys are being routed, you know, and there is something kind of like, this is not your normal boy, you know?
No, it's fantastic. It's fantastic. All right. So, anything else, or are we done here?
I think we're done here. I highly recommend this film. I know that it's kind of a pain tracking down, but but it's not a bore. So you may be like Thomas, someone who finds the thought of this it sounds very epic and exciting, or you may be like me, who probably you may be thinking.
And I think
gee,
you liked the movie before more than I did, probably.
I think I did. I really did enjoy it. Probably the only spot where it really began to slow down for me was in the extended romance with Josephine, but it was made up for by this weird shrine to Napoleon bit at the end. That was trippy.
Yeah. Well, we'll be coming back soon with a wrap up. We're not done with the Vatican film list, obviously, because we have to look back on the whole list and talk about it and give our thoughts. So we'll be back soon enough with an episode on that. But in the meantime, thanks everybody for, especially those who have accompanied us on this journey from the beginning. Thanks to you all for listening, and we'll see you soon. We'll see you soon, and we'll have more plans after we finish this Vatican film list as well.
Criteria is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Mike Aquilina, Catholic Culture audiobooks, bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and the Catholic Culture Podcast, an interview show exploring Catholic arts, culture, and issues. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.